She checked into a luxury hotel to escape her fame, armed with a single rule to protect her broken heart. But she never anticipated its mysterious billionaire owner, a man whose silent attention threatened to shatter every defense she had carefully built around her soul. Let me know what city you're listening from in the comments below. Harper Morris felt the hotel before she saw it. It was in the air itself, a subtle shift from the wild, salt-laced wind of the coastline to something more refined, a scent of manicured cypress and night-blooming jasmine. The car moved with a hushed purr over gravel that sounded like crushed pearls, finally stopping before an entrance that was less a door and more a gateway to another world. The Aurelia Grand did not shout its wealth. It whispered it in the elegant arch of the stonework and the silent deference of the staff who emerged as if summoned by thought alone. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, the feeling of being an imposter in a world she could afford, but could never truly belong to. Inside, the silence was cathedral-like, broken only by the distant murmur of the sea and the soft click of her heels on the marble floor. The lobby was a symphony of cream and gold, vast and yet strangely intimate, with soaring ceilings from which hung a chandelier that dripped crystal light like captured rain. A woman with a serene smile checked her in without a single superfluous word, her efficiency, a testament to the hotel's promise of seamless, invisible service. It was exactly the anonymity Harper craved, and yet standing there she had never felt more seen, more exposed in her exhaustion, her fame a ghost she could feel hovering just over her shoulder. Her suite was a sanctuary of quiet opulence. A wall of glass opened onto a private balcony, offering an uninterrupted view of the Mediterranean, its surface a sheet of deep sapphire under the afternoon sun. The furniture was elegant, the fabrics were impossibly soft beneath her fingertips, and the air was cool and still. It was perfect. It was also profoundly empty, a beautiful hollow space that mirrored the part of her where music used to live. She walked to the window, pressing a hand against the cool glass, watching a lone sailboat drift lazily toward the horizon, a perfect picture of a peace she couldn't remember how to feel. This was the reason she had run here, to escape the noise of the city, the flash of cameras, the well-meaning but suffocating concern of her friends, and most of all, the sharp, lingering echo of a promise being broken. She had built her career on baring her soul, and now her soul felt like a plundered ruin. And so, she had made a rule, a single inflexible mandate for this retreat. No distractions, no complications, and absolutely no men who saw a woman not as a person, but as a beautiful object to be acquired, a song to be owned. She was here for silence, not another gilded cage. From her suitcase, she pulled not expensive clothes or jewelry, but a simple leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with empty staves and the ghosts of lyrics she couldn't finish. It looked entirely out of place against the silk throw on the bed, a piece of her real, messy life trespassing in this curated perfection. She placed it on the bedside table, a silent vow to herself. This was her work. This was her only purpose here. To find the melody that had been stolen by the noise, to rediscover the voice that was truly her own, untangled from the expectations and demands of others. Later, as twilight began to bleed purple and rose across the sky, she stepped onto the balcony, wrapping a cashmere robe around herself. The sea air was a balm. She let her gaze wander over the hotel's sprawling, tiered architecture and was drawn to a window in the main villa, set apart from the rest. A silhouette stood there, a man, perfectly still, looking not at her, but out at the same sea. He was too far to see clearly, but his presence was a sudden, sharp note in the otherwise placid evening, a stillness that seemed to command the very air around it. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cooling air. She told herself it was nothing, just another wealthy guest enjoying the view. But she couldn't shake the feeling that his solitude was different from hers. Hers was a shield, a retreat from a battle she had lost. His felt like a throne, a quiet dominion over everything he surveyed. She pulled her robe tighter, retreating back into her room, firmly reminding herself of the rule that was meant to keep her safe. And yet, as she closed the door on the fading light, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been seen in a way she hadn't been in a very long time. From his private library, a room insulated from the world by thousands of books and paneled in dark, fragrant cedar, Jasper Scott held the silence like a precious commodity. It was the ultimate luxury, the one thing his vast fortune had struggled to purchase, but that this hotel, his fortress, finally provided. He had built an empire on predicting trends, on understanding the chaotic symphony of the markets. But here, his life was governed by quiet observation, by the controlled and predictable rhythm of the tides he could see from his window. He found the world of people to be loud, their motives tangled and tiresome. Here, there was only clarity. He had seen the woman on the balcony earlier. He didn't know her name, nor did he care about the fame that often brought guests to his hotel. He cared about patterns, and she was an anomaly. She wasn't preening for a photograph or speaking loudly into a phone. She stood with a quiet fragility that seemed at odds with the strength in her posture. A woman holding herself together against a current only she could feel. She had looked at his hotel not with the jaded eyes of the wealthy, but with a kind of weary desperation, as if seeking asylum. The thought was intriguing. Days passed in their separate solitudes. Then, one night, the weather turned. A storm, magnificent and violent, rolled in from the sea, throwing sheets of rain against the immense windows of the hotel. Jasper stood in the darkened grand salon, watching the lightning illuminate the churning waves, feeling a kinship with the storm's untamable energy. It was in these moments, when nature asserted its power, that his own felt insignificant, and the release was a comfort. He was entirely alone, the hotel's guests safely in their rooms, the staff a discreet presence in the background, and then he heard it. Beneath the percussive drumming of the rain and the low rumble of thunder, another sound drifted through the cavernous space. It was a voice, a woman's voice, humming a melody that was pure, unadorned sorrow. It was faint, almost imagined, a thread of sound so raw and beautiful it seemed to be a part of the storm itself. It pulled at something deep inside him, a curiosity that was sharper and more urgent than any business deal. He moved silently through the salon, following the sound to its source. On her balcony, shielded from the worst of the rain by a deep overhang, Harper had given up on sleep. The storm outside was a perfect match for the one inside her, and she felt a strange sense of peace in its fury. Believing herself to be utterly alone in the dead of night, she let the music come. It wasn't a song, not yet, just a string of notes, a wordless melody that carried all the grief and exhaustion she had been holding back. She closed her eyes, letting her voice weave into the sound of the rain, a private lament offered only to the turbulent sea and sky. Jasper stopped on a lower, secluded stone terrace, obscured by the deep shadows of a sculpted cypress. He could see her now, a figure wrapped in white, her face tilted up toward the stormy sky. He listened, utterly captivated. This was not a performance. There was no vanity in it, no technique meant to impress. It was the sound of a heart breaking, or perhaps the sound of a heart trying to piece itself back together. In a world of artifice and calculation, it was the most real, the most painfully authentic thing he had encountered in years. He remained in the shadows, not daring to move, not even to breathe too deeply. To step forward would be a violation. It would shatter the sanctity of the moment, turn her honest expression into a self-conscious performance for an audience of one. The realization came to him with an unexpected and startling force. He felt a fierce, primal need to protect this moment, to protect the solitude of the unseen singer and her private, beautiful sorrow. He would not let his world or anyone in it touch this. He would find out who she was, not to possess her song, but to ensure no one ever interrupted it again. The morning after the storm, the world felt washed clean. The air that drifted into Harper's suite was crisp and heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and salt. She felt lighter, as if the storm had taken her whispered melody and carried some of her sorrow out to sea with it. For the first time since arriving, she felt a genuine desire to explore, to walk outside the beautiful confines of her room. She dressed in simple linen trousers and a soft sweater, leaving her phone behind, and made her way to the hotel's famed terraced gardens. She followed a winding stone path, her fingers trailing over the cool, waxy petals of white roses that were heavy with raindrops, each one a tiny, perfect prism. The garden was an oasis of tranquility, the only sounds the gentle drip of water from leaves and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the waves below. The peace of it all was seeping into her, loosening the tightness in her chest. A new melody, quieter and more hopeful than the last, began to thread its way through her thoughts. A fragile green shoot pushing through cracked earth. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the quality of the silence that made her realize she was no longer alone. She looked up, her gaze drawn across a small, ornate fountain where a lone figure stood. It was him, the man from the window. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, yet he wore it with a casual ease that made it seem less like armor and more like a second skin. But it was his eyes that held her captive. His gaze was direct, calm, and held an unnerving perception that made her feel he could see past the singer and straight into the woman beneath. For a long moment, the world seemed to freeze. The space between them shimmered with an unspoken tension, the sound of the fountain's gentle splashing suddenly as loud as a roar. He didn't smile, didn't offer a polite nod, didn't make any move to approach her. He simply watched her, and in the depths of his steady gray eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. It wasn't just the recognition of another guest. It was a profound, quiet acknowledgement, as if he were listening to a silence only they could both hear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked bird. Her rule, her one shield, screamed in her mind. This was the man it was written for. The power he radiated wasn't in ostentatious displays of wealth, but in this absolute, unnerving stillness. The self-assurance of a man who owned the very ground she stood on. He was dangerous to her peace. With a will she didn't know she possessed, she broke the gaze first, turning her attention to a particularly perfect rose, a small, desperate act of defiance. She felt, more than saw, his reaction. There was no offense taken, no sign of a bruised ego. Instead, she sensed an acceptance of her retreat. From the corner of her eye, she saw him give a slow, almost imperceptible nod to himself, a silent agreement to terms she hadn't even stated. It was an acknowledgement that he understood she needed this space, that he saw the invisible walls she had built around herself. He saw them, and he would not try to breach them. He then turned and walked away down another path, his footsteps making no sound, disappearing behind a hedge of blooming bougainvillea. He left her standing there with the scent of wet roses and the thunderous, frantic beat of her own heart. The silent encounter had been more startlingly intimate than 100 conversations. He hadn't spoken a single word, yet he had promised to respect her solitude, to grant her the distance she so desperately needed. But a promise of distance from a man with that much intensity felt less like a relief and more like a challenge her heart was not remotely ready for. In the days that followed their silent encounter in the garden, Harper dedicated herself to her work with a renewed, almost desperate focus. She treated her rule not just as a guideline, but as a lifeline. To keep the memory of that unnervingly perceptive gaze at bay, she sought out the most isolated parts of the hotel, searching for a space where she could be completely, utterly alone. She found it in the hotel's library. It was a magnificent 2-story rotunda, filled with the hushed, sacred scent of aging paper and lemon oil polish. It was a forgotten room, a place of stillness in a world of constant motion, and she felt an immediate kinship with it. She chose a small alcove near a window overlooking a quiet, moss-covered courtyard. The light was soft, filtered through the thick, leaded glass, and the silence was absolute. Here, she felt safe. She opened her notebook, the blank pages a stark white canvas against the dark wood of the table. A melody began to form in her mind, fragile at first, then slowly gaining strength, inspired by the quiet dignity of the room. She began to hum softly, her voice barely a whisper, a tentative exploration of a new musical idea. It felt like the first true breath she had taken in months. Lost in her work, she let her guard down, allowing the creative current to pull her under. It was only when a page of her notebook slipped from the table, whispering to the floor, that the spell was broken. As she bent to retrieve it, her eyes caught a subtle movement in the deep shadows of the far corner of the room. There, in a high-backed leather armchair that had seemed empty just moments before, sat Jasper Scott. He wasn't looking at her. He was holding a heavy, leather-bound book, his posture one of complete absorption. A cold shock coursed through her. How long had he been there? Had he heard her? The silence she had mistaken for solitude was, in fact, a shared silence. Every note she had hummed, every word she had scribbled, had been laid bare before an audience of one. She felt a hot blush of embarrassment and anger creep up her neck. Her sanctuary had been violated. She felt the immediate instinctual urge to flee, to gather her things and run back to the sterile safety of her suite. But as she watched him, she realized he was not an intruder. He was as much a part of the library's quiet landscape as the books themselves. He hadn't announced his presence, hadn't made a single sound to draw attention to himself. He had simply been there, existing in his own world of silence. He seemed to sense her turmoil because he slowly lifted his head, his gray eyes finding hers across the vast room. There was no judgment in his expression, no hint of amusement. There was only that same calm, quiet acknowledgement she had seen in the garden. He held her gaze for a beat, a silent question passing between them. He was not asking her to leave. In fact, his stillness seemed to be an invitation for her to stay, a reassurance that her space was still her own, even with him in it. He then lowered his eyes back to his book, a deliberate release, a granting of the privacy she craved. He had given her an out, but he had also given her a choice, to run from this unexpected connection, or to sit with it. She stared at him, her heart a frantic, fluttering thing. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to reinforce the walls he had so effortlessly bypassed. But another part of her, a foolish, curious part she had thought long dead, was intrigued by this man who spoke volumes without ever saying a word, who offered solitude even in his presence. The room was no longer empty, but it still felt safe, albeit in a new, far more dangerous way. She took a slow breath, turned back to her table, and with a hand that trembled slightly, she picked up her pen. Harper decided to brave the hotel's main dining terrace for dinner that evening. It was a strategic move, an attempt to reclaim a sense of normalcy, to prove to herself that the silent presence of one man couldn't confine her to her room. The terrace was breathtaking, set under a canopy of ancient olive trees strung with tiny glowing lights that glittered like a private constellation. The air was soft, and the clink of silverware against porcelain was a gentle, soothing rhythm beneath the sound of the distant waves. She chose a small table in a secluded corner, hoping to remain a footnote in the elegant scene. She ordered her meal, focusing on the simple act of reading the menu, of sipping her water, of watching the other guests. They were a portrait of effortless wealth, their conversations a low, confident murmur. She felt the familiar pang of being an outsider, a performer whose ticket to this world was temporary, paid for by a talent that had recently abandoned her. She felt a sudden, sharp longing for a simple restaurant, for a meal that wasn't a performance, for a life where she didn't feel like she was constantly being watched. And then she felt a shift in the energy of the terrace. Jasper Scott had arrived. He moved with an economy of motion that was both graceful and commanding, the staff parting before him with a reverence that was clearly unfeigned. He was seated at his own table, also in a quiet corner, with a clear view of the entire terrace, but angled in a way that seemed to discourage any approach. He didn't look in her direction. He simply opened a small, slim book and began to read, a man entirely self-contained, an island of stillness in the gentle social currents of the evening. Harper tried to ignore him, focusing on her food, on the taste of the fresh sea bass and the crispness of the wine, but it was impossible. His presence was a magnetic force, a low hum of energy at the edge of her awareness. She was intensely conscious of every move he made, of the way he turned a page, of the way the flickering candlelight carved shadows across the sharp planes of his face. She felt like a musician hyper-aware of the lead instrument, even when it was playing softly. Just as she was finishing her main course, a waiter approached her table bearing a small, exquisite dessert, a single, perfect panna cotta drizzled with a dark, glistening berry coulis. "I'm sorry," she began. "I didn't order this." The waiter gave a small, professional smile. "It is a gift, Ms. Morris, with compliments from Mr. Scott. He is particularly fond of the chef's work with local berries and thought you might enjoy it." The waiter placed the dessert on her table and retreated with silent efficiency. Harper's fork froze halfway to her lips. She stared at the dessert, a beautiful, innocent thing that felt like a declaration. It wasn't a grand, ostentatious gesture. It was small, specific, and thoughtful. It was also a clear and undeniable breach of her rule. He had reached across the space between them, not with a word, but with a taste, an offering. It was a gesture of a perfect host, perhaps, but it felt infinitely more personal than that. It felt like he was paying attention. Slowly, she lifted her eyes and looked directly at him. He must have felt her gaze, because he looked up from his book at the exact same moment. For a brief, heart-stopping second, their eyes locked across the softly lit terrace. He gave her a single slow nod, a gesture of confirmation that was both impossibly polite and devastatingly intimate. It was an acknowledgement of her, of the shared moment, of the unspoken thing that was beginning to arc between them. He had offered a gift, and by simply meeting his gaze, she knew she had just accepted more than a dessert. The next morning, a fresh wave of creative energy surged through Harper. The melody that had been whispering in her mind was now demanding to be heard, to be given a voice and a body. But the confines of her suite, beautiful as they were, felt stifling. She needed space, she needed acoustics, she needed the resonant soul of a real instrument. She needed a piano. She called the front desk, her request simple. She asked if there was a piano, perhaps in a quiet lounge or a music room, that she could use for a few hours. The concierge, a man with a voice as smooth as polished marble, was apologetic but firm. The grand piano in the main salon was strictly for the hotel's resident musician in the evenings, and the other lounges were booked for private functions. He could, perhaps, arrange for an electronic keyboard to be brought to her suite, but it would take some time. Harper's heart sank. The fragile, fleeting inspiration was already beginning to fade, dissolving like mist against the wall of polite corporate procedure. An electronic keyboard felt like a sad imitation of the real, vibrant sound her song needed. She was about to thank him and hang up, feeling the familiar sting of frustration, when a second voice joined the call. It was a man's voice, low and calm, a voice she recognized instantly, even though she had never heard it speak. "Pierre," the voice said, and the authority in that single word was absolute. "The West Wing Music Room. It has the 1920s Steinway. Please have it opened for Ms. Morris, and ensure she is not disturbed." There was a pause, a beat of charged silence on the line. Harper's breath hitched. She was still on the line, an accidental eavesdropper on a command she was not meant to hear. The concierge's tone shifted, becoming warmer, more deferential. "Of course, Mr. Scott." At once. Then Jasper's voice, now directed at her, startlingly close through the phone's receiver. "Ms. Morris," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was a physical shock. "The instrument has a unique tone. I hope it helps you find what you're looking for." Before she could stammer out a thank you, before she could even process the fact that he had not only intervened but had understood the unspoken need behind her request, the need for a specific kind of artistic tool, he was gone. The line was silent for a moment before the concierge returned, his voice bright with a newfound desire to please. He gave her the directions, informing her that the room would be ready and waiting for her, her privacy guaranteed. She hung up the phone, her hand resting on the receiver, her mind reeling. He hadn't just solved a problem. He had understood the artist's frustration. He knew the difference between a real piano and an electronic substitute. He knew which instrument in his vast, luxurious hotel had a unique tone. He had been listening, not just with his ears, but with a deep, intuitive understanding that stripped away all her defenses. He saw her not as a famous guest to be placated, but as a creator in need of her craft. The gesture was more intimate than a touch, more revealing than a long conversation. She stood in the middle of her suite, the silence buzzing with the echo of his voice. Her rule had been about keeping men and their power at a distance. But Jasper Scott's power wasn't a wall or a cage. It was a key. He had just used it to open a door for her, a door she hadn't even known existed. And as she prepared to walk through it, she felt a terrifying, thrilling sense of possibility. He had protected her work, and in doing so, he had reached the one part of her she had thought was safely locked away. The West Wing Music Room was not just a room. It was a memory preserved in amber. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the faint, sweet scent of aged wood and old sheet music. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a tall, arched window, falling in a golden pool across the polished floorboards. And in the center of that pool of light, like a sleeping black panther, was the Steinway. It was magnificent, its lacquer gleaming with a deep liquid shine, its elegant lines speaking of a bygone era of craftsmanship and artistry. It was a room that demanded silence, a place where sound was not a casual thing, but an event. Harper approached the piano with a reverence she hadn't felt in years. She ran her fingers lightly over the closed lid, the wood warm and smooth beneath her touch. This was his, a part of his private world. The thought was a dangerous, thrilling tremor in her veins. He had given her a key, not just to a room, but to a part of himself. She felt the weight of that trust, of that unspoken understanding. It was a responsibility that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was no longer just a guest. She was a confidant in a conversation that had barely begun. Slowly, she sat on the worn velvet of the piano bench, the silence of the room pressing in on her. For a long moment, she simply breathed, letting the peace of the space settle over her. Then, she lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys. The ivory was cool and solid like river stones. She hesitated, a wave of performance anxiety, or something more personal, washing over her. What if the music didn't come? What if this grand gesture was wasted on her broken inspiration? What if she had nothing left to say? She pressed a single key. The note that emerged was unlike any she had ever heard from a modern instrument. It was rich, resonant, with a deep, melancholic soul. It was, as he had said, a unique tone. It was the sound of history, of quiet evenings and long-forgotten conversations. It was a voice, and it was asking for hers in return. And so, she began to play. The melody that had been a fragile whisper in her mind now flowed from her fingertips, strong and sure. It was a song of solitude, of a storm weathered, of a quiet hope found in an unexpected place. Her voice, when it came, was soft at first, then grew in power, filling the room, weaving through the columns of sunlight. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the music, in the perfect harmony between her feelings and the piano's soulful response. This was why she sang, not for the fame, not for the applause, but for this moment of pure, unadulterated creation, where the wall between her inner world and the outer world dissolved, and there was only the song. It was a piece of her soul, given form in the air. She played for what could have been minutes or an hour. When the final note faded into the reverent silence, she let her hands fall from the keys, her body trembling with the emotional aftermath. A profound sense of release washed over her, a feeling of lightness, of catharsis. She had found it, the thing she had come here to reclaim. She had found her voice again, here in his piano room. The gratitude she felt was so immense it was painful, a sharp, aching pressure in her chest. But as she sat in the echoing silence, a new, more complicated realization dawned. The song she had just poured from her soul wasn't just about her own sorrow or her own hope. It was colored by the gray of his eyes, by the memory of his silent presence in the library, by the low timbre of his voice over the phone. She had been singing about the storm inside her. Yes, but she had also been singing to the man who had given her a sanctuary in which to weather it. She realized with a terrifying clarity that the song was no longer hers alone. Leaving the music room felt like waking from a dream. The hallway of the hotel seemed too bright, the air too thin. Harper felt emotionally raw, as if the music had stripped away a protective layer of skin, leaving her nerves exposed to the world. She needed to walk, to feel the solid earth beneath her feet and the open sky above her head. She bypassed the immaculate main gardens, seeking out a less traveled path she had noticed earlier, one that wound down the cliffside toward a small secluded cove. As dusk began to settle, the sky turned a soft, bruised purple, and the first stars pricked the darkness. The path was narrow, lined with wild, fragrant herbs that released their scent as she brushed past them. The rhythmic crash and retreat of the waves below was a primal, soothing heartbeat, a sound that put her own frantic pulse into perspective. She was so lost in thought, so focused on the internal landscape of her own emotions, that she almost didn't see him until she was only a few feet away. He was standing on a small stone overlook, a place where the path widened to accommodate an old, gnarled olive tree. He wasn't looking out at the sea. He was looking at the path, as if he had been waiting for her. He wasn't an accidental presence this time. His stillness was deliberate, purposeful. The surprise of seeing him there, in this wild, secluded place, stole the air from her lungs. There was no escape, no polite retreat she could make. There was only him, a dark, solid silhouette against the fading light. He didn't startle her with a sudden movement or a loud greeting. He simply watched her approach, allowing her the space to compose herself. As she stopped before him, he finally spoke, and his voice was as low and calm as the evening tide. "The melody was haunting," he said. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact, an observation. It sounded like it belonged to this place. He had not only heard her, he had understood. He had heard the sea and the stone and the solitude woven into her notes. Harper didn't know what to say. "Thank you," felt inadequate. "How did you know I'd be here?" Felt accusatory. So she said nothing, merely nodding, clutching the thin cardigan she wore more tightly around herself. He seemed to understand her speechlessness, the overwhelming mix of gratitude and intimidation she was feeling. He took a small, almost imperceptible step to the side, a subtle gesture that cleared the path, but also created a space for her to stand beside him, if she chose. "The world can be a very loud place," he said, his gaze finally turning toward the sea, a silver ribbon under the rising moon. "It's easy to lose your own note in all the noise." He was talking about her music, but she knew he was also talking about himself, about the fortress of silence he had built around his life. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire, and she wasn't a famous singer. They were just two people who understood the value of quiet, the search for a single, authentic sound in a world full of echoes. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight, but his eyes held a glint of the starlight above. "Dine with me tonight, Harper," he said, his use of her first name a quiet intimacy that landed with the force of a physical touch. "Not in the restaurant. Somewhere quiet. I think we have more to talk about than music." It wasn't a request backed by power. It was a simple, direct invitation from one solitary soul to another, and she heard herself say the one word she had promised she would never utter here. Yes. He led her not to a private dining room within the hotel, but up a hidden spiral staircase to a part of the villa she hadn't known existed, his personal rooftop terrace. The space was breathtaking in its simplicity. There was no opulent furniture, only a single small table set for two, surrounded by lush, fragrant, night-blooming jasmine. The sky was a vast velvet dome of stars, and the only light came from a handful of flickering lanterns that cast a warm, intimate glow. It felt like they were on the top of the world, suspended between the sea and the sky, in a bubble of perfect privacy. Harper felt a tremor of nerves as he pulled out her chair. This was a deliberate, undeniable step across a line she had drawn in the sand. Her rule was not just broken, it was shattered, its pieces scattered to the wind. She wore a simple silk dress, feeling woefully underdressed, and yet, in his presence, oddly comfortable. He didn't seem to notice or care about clothes. He looked at her as if he were seeing something far more essential, something beneath the surface. The meal was served by a single silent attendant who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. There was no fussy presentation, just simple, perfectly prepared food that tasted of the sea and the local earth. The conversation, when it began, was just as unpretentious. He didn't ask about her career, her fame, or her last album. Instead, he asked about the piano in the West Wing. "My grandmother taught me to play on it," he said, his voice softer here, in his own space. "She said it held its secrets until it found a player it could trust." The implication hung in the air between them. The piano had trusted her. Harper found herself opening up, telling him about her first music teacher, about the feeling of writing a song that felt more true than her own skin. She spoke of her creative exhaustion not as a professional setback, but as a deep personal grief, the loss of a language she once spoke fluently. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his full attention a gift she hadn't realized how much she craved. In return, he offered her a small, carefully chosen piece of his own story. He spoke of building his empire, not with pride, but with a quiet weariness. He talked about the crushing weight of other people's expectations, of living a life where every interaction was a transaction, every relationship a negotiation. He had built the Aurelia Grand not as a monument to his wealth, but as a refuge from it, a place where he could simply be, without the constant performance of being Jasper Scott. As he spoke, she watched the play of lantern light on his face, the way it softened the sharp lines of his jaw and revealed a vulnerability in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The tension between them was no longer one of nervous uncertainty. It had deepened, transformed into a low, resonant hum of awareness. She was intensely conscious of the small space between them, of the warmth emanating from his hand as it rested near hers on the table. of the way his gaze would linger on her lips when she spoke. The silence that fell between them now was not empty. It was filled with everything they weren't saying, with the magnetic pull that was growing stronger with every shared confidence, every shared look. He looked at her, his head tilted slightly, and the polite mask of the hotel owner was gone, replaced by the unguarded expression of a man who was seeing a woman he wanted, not for her fame, but for the quiet song he had heard in her soul. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt the full, terrifying weight of his unspoken desire. The rooftop dinner shifted something between them, irrevocably. The carefully constructed boundaries of guest and host, of two strangers sharing a space, had dissolved under the starlight, replaced by a fragile, thrilling intimacy. In the days that followed, their encounters were no longer accidental. There was a quiet, unspoken rhythm to their interactions, a dance of proximity and retreat that was as intricate as any melody Harper had ever composed. She would find a book of poetry left on the table in her library alcove. He would hear a new, tentative piece of music drifting from the west wing in the late afternoon. One evening, unable to sleep, she found herself walking the moonlit beach of the private cove. The sand was cool and damp under her bare feet, the waves whispering secrets to the shore. She saw him standing near the water's edge, a tall, solitary figure looking out at the dark expanse. She felt no hesitation this time, no urge to turn back. She walked toward him, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. He turned as she approached, his expression calm, as if he had been expecting her all along. They walked together along the shoreline, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of electricity through her. They didn't speak of business or the outside world. He told her about the constellations, pointing out Andromeda and Cassiopeia, his knowledge of the night sky as deep and surprising as his knowledge of vintage pianos. He spoke of the stars not as distant balls of gas, but as ancient storytellers, and she felt the stirrings of a new song, one about finding a fixed point in a vast, spinning universe. He stopped, turning to face her. The moonlight silvered the edges of his hair and carved his face into stark, beautiful relief. "You are not like the others who come here, Harper," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost beneath the sound of the waves. "They come for the luxury, for the escape. They want to be seen. You came here to become invisible." The observation was so astute, so piercingly accurate, it left her feeling completely exposed. He saw the core of her, the wounded part that had sought refuge in anonymity. "Sometimes invisibility is the only way to heal," she whispered, the words tasting of salt and vulnerability. His gaze softened and a profound, aching tenderness bloomed in his eyes. He lifted a hand, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his fingers brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, a gesture so gentle, so restrained, it was more intimate than any kiss. The air crackled between them, thick with unspoken longing. "And what happens?" he murmured, his hand dropping back to his side, the loss of his potential touch a sudden, sharp ache. "When you're ready to be seen again." The question was not just about her career. It was about him, about the two of them, standing on a deserted beach in the middle of the night. He was asking if she was ready to be seen by him. The intensity in his eyes was a direct challenge to the last crumbling remnants of her rule, to the fear that still held a piece of her heart captive. The moment stretched, taut and shimmering. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the sound of the sea and the frantic, hopeful beating of her own heart. He was offering her a choice, a chance to step out from the shadows she had hidden in for so long. But stepping into the light of his attention felt like stepping off a cliff, a free fall into something powerful and unknown. She held his gaze, knowing her answer would change everything. Harper retreated from the intensity of the beach, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a terrifying, unfamiliar hope. She spent the next day in a self-imposed exile, avoiding the library, the gardens, the terraces, any place where their orbits might intersect. She needed to think, to untangle the knot of her own feelings. The rule she had created was a simple shield against a simple threat, the powerful man who would see her as a prize. But Jasper was not simple. His power was in his restraint, his seduction was in his silence, his desire was in the way he saw her, not the way he wanted to possess her. She sat on her balcony, her notebook open but untouched, staring at the endless blue of the sea. She had come here to find her music, and she had. But the music was now inextricably linked to him. The melodies were imbued with the memory of his quiet presence, the lyrics haunted by the depth of his unspoken questions. To embrace the music, did she have to embrace the muse? The thought sent a ripple of both fear and longing through her. The last time she had let her life and her art become so entangled with a man, it had nearly destroyed them both. That evening, a storm rolled in, more sudden and ferocious than the last. The sky turned a bruised, angry gray, and the wind howled around the corners of the hotel, rattling the great glass windows of her suite. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging her into a thick, velvety darkness. A moment later, a soft, discreet knock sounded at her door. Her heart leaped. She knew, with an instinct that defied all logic, that it was him. She opened the door to find him standing there, holding a single old-fashioned oil lamp. The golden light cast his face in flickering shadows, making him look like a figure from another time. He wasn't dressed in his usual impeccable suit, but in a simple dark sweater and trousers, as if the storm had stripped away the last layer of his formal armor. "I assumed you might not care for the dark," he said simply. "The backup generators will be on shortly for the main systems, but the private wings can take a moment." He stepped inside, his presence filling the dark room. He placed the lamp on a small table, its warm glow pushing back the shadows, creating a small, intimate circle of light in the vast suite. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic symphony, but inside this small bubble of light, there was a profound and startling stillness. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the wind and the rain and the frantic beat of her own heart. He hadn't come to fix a problem. He had come to share the darkness with her. "I am not afraid of the dark," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I am afraid of what I'm starting to see in the light." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and raw. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The scent of him, rain, old books, and something uniquely, masculinely his, filled her senses. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below her ear. The touch was electric, a spark in the darkness that lit a fire deep within her. "And what do you see, Harper?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her bones. His face was so close now, his eyes dark and serious in the lamplight, searching hers for an answer she wasn't sure she had. She could feel the tremor in her own body, the surrender that was pulling at her, urging her to lean into his touch, to close the last inch of space between them. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the tempest inside Harper. His touch was a brand, his proximity a dizzying, intoxicating force that pulled all the air from her lungs. She looked up at him, her lips parted, the answer to his question lost in the overwhelming sensory reality of his presence. This was the moment she had been running from, the point of no return. The precipice she had been so afraid of was here, and all she wanted to do was jump. With a slowness that was agonizing, he leaned in, his gaze never leaving hers. He was giving her every opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to retreat back to the safety of her rule. It was a silent offering of control, a testament to the respect that underpinned his desire. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the storm. She didn't move. She couldn't. She met his gaze, and in that shared look, she gave him her silent, unequivocal permission. His lips met hers, and the world fell away. The kiss was not demanding or aggressive. It was a question, a discovery. It was soft, tentative at first, then deepened as he felt her response, the subtle, instinctive way she leaned into him. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and longing, a slow burn that ignited a fire that had been smoldering between them since that first silent encounter in the garden. His hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her gently, possessively. She melted against him, her hands coming up to rest on the hard planes of his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms, a rhythm that seemed to sync with her own. All the fear, all the doubt, all the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, turned to dust, washed away by a tidal wave of feeling. There was no thought, no analysis, only this, only him. The rightness of it was a physical shock, a deep resonant chord that vibrated through her entire being. He broke the kiss slowly, resting his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the warm, lamplit air. His eyes were closed, and his expression was one of intense, unguarded emotion. He looked like a man who had been starving and had just been given a taste of something he had craved for a lifetime. The sight of his vulnerability, his raw, undisguised need, was more intimate than the kiss itself. It was a glimpse behind the final curtain, into the soul of the man he kept hidden from the world. Harper, he whispered, her name a prayer against her lips. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. In that single word, she heard everything. The loneliness he carried, the quiet desperation of his solitude, and the profound, startling hope she had brought into his carefully controlled world. The power had shifted. She was no longer just the recipient of his attention. She was a participant, an equal force in this overwhelming connection. He kissed her again, a deeper, more certain kiss this time, a kiss of claiming and of being claimed. The storm could rage all it wanted. The only world that mattered was the one that existed right here, in this small circle of golden light, in the shelter of his arms. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a world scrubbed clean and silent. The wind died down to a whisper, and the only sound was the gentle dripping of water from the leaves outside the balcony. The hotel's power returned with a soft hum, and the lamps in the suite flickered back to life, flooding the room with a light that felt harsh and intrusive after the intimacy of the darkness. They broke apart slowly, reluctantly, the spell of the storm-shrouded moment gently dissolving, leaving behind a new, palpable reality in its wake. Jasper's expression was serious in the bright light, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for any sign of regret. Harper met his gaze without flinching, her heart still beating a rapid, unsteady rhythm. There was no regret. There was only a profound sense of having crossed a threshold into a new and uncharted territory. The fear was still there, a faint, trembling echo in the back of her mind, but it was overshadowed by a feeling of rightness, of coming home to a place she had never known existed. He didn't fill the silence with easy words or promises. He simply took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a warm, solid anchor in the sea of her emotions. "Stay," he said, his voice a low, quiet command that was also a plea. "Don't go back to your room. Stay here, with me." He wasn't talking about just the night. He was talking about the space they had created, this bubble of understanding and connection. He was asking her not to retreat, not to rebuild the walls his kiss had just dismantled. He led her to the sitting area, to the plush sofa that faced the wall of glass. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting a path of liquid silver across the calm, dark water. They sat together, not talking, her head resting on his shoulder, his arms securely around her. It was a different kind of intimacy from the fire of their kiss, quieter, deeper. It was an intimacy of shared presence, of two solitudes merging into a comfortable, peaceful whole. She had never felt this with anyone before, this sense of being completely herself, completely seen, without the need for performance or explanation. She must have drifted off to sleep, lulled by the rhythm of his breathing and the profound sense of safety she felt in his arms. When she woke, the first light of dawn was painting the horizon in soft shades of gray and rose. A light cashmere blanket had been draped over her, and she was still nestled against him. He was awake, his gaze fixed on the rising sun, but she could feel that his attention, his awareness, was entirely focused on her. He had watched over her while she slept. The gesture was so simple, so tender, so fiercely protective, it made her heart ache. In the cold, cynical world she came from, men took. They took your time, your body, your song. But Jasper Scott, he gave. He gave silence. He gave understanding. He gave sanctuary. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, a woman who had lost her voice, and instead of taking advantage, he had built her a cathedral of quiet in which to find it again. She stirred, and his gaze dropped to hers. A slow, gentle smile touched his lips, a true smile that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face, making him look younger, more unguarded. "Good morning, Harper," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. And in the quiet light of the new day, she knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and wonderful, that her life had been irrevocably altered. The rule was gone, and in its place was the beginning of a song she had never imagined she would write. The next few days unfolded like a secret dream. To the rest of the hotel, they were simply the owner and a reclusive guest. But in the private spaces they carved out for themselves, the rooftop terrace under the stars, the deserted beach at dawn, the resonant silence of the West Wing music room, they began to build a world of their own. The physical tension that had defined their early encounters had softened, replaced by an easy, confident intimacy. The slightest touch of his hand on the small of her back as they walked, the way she would lean her head on his shoulder as he read to her from an old book of poetry. These small gestures became their new language. Harper felt herself blooming in the warmth of his attention. Her music, which had been a painful, solitary struggle, now became a joyful act of communication. She played for him, not as a performance, but as a way of showing him the parts of herself that had no words. She played the joyful, soaring melody of their first kiss, the quiet, contemplative notes of their shared silences, the deep, resonant chords of the security she felt in his presence. Her notebook filled with new lyrics, new ideas, a torrent of creativity unleashed by the simple act of being happy. He in turn opened his world to her. He showed her the hidden parts of the hotel, the old wine cellar with its dusty, forgotten vintages, the small private observatory where he charted the stars, the workshop where he restored antique clocks, his hands surprisingly deft and gentle. With each new discovery, she saw another facet of the man behind the myth. He was not just a billionaire. He was a scholar, a craftsman, a lonely king who had built a beautiful empty kingdom and was only now, with her, learning how to live in it. One afternoon, as they sat in the library, a comfortable silence between them, he looked up from his book, his expression thoughtful. "I have to leave for a few days," he said, the words dropping into the quiet room with the weight of stones. "Business in Zurich, an old obligation I can't break." Harper felt a sudden sharp pang of disappointment, a cold dread that surprised her with its intensity. The thought of this place without him, of their bubble being burst by the intrusion of the outside world, was unbearable. He must have seen the flicker of anxiety in her eyes, because he reached across the space between them and took her hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. "It's only for 2 days," he said softly, "but I have a request. Don't stop playing. Don't let the silence of this place become empty again. Keep it filled with your music. For me." It was the first time he had ever asked anything of her, and the request was not for a promise of fidelity, but for a promise of art. He was asking her to protect the very soul of what they had built together. That evening, he arranged for a simple dinner to be served in her suite. It felt different from their rooftop meal. It was quieter, tinged with the melancholy of their impending separation. As he was about to leave, he stopped at the door, turning back to face her. The look on his face was one of raw, unguarded emotion, a look of a man who was leaving behind something more precious than any business deal or empire. "When I get back," he said, his voice low and intense, "I don't want to be Jasper Scott, the owner of this hotel, anymore. And I don't want you to be Harper Morris, the singer hiding from the world. I just want us to be Jasper and Harper." The declaration was a promise of a future, of a reality beyond the magical confines of the Aurelia Grand. He was asking her to be ready for a life with him, and she wasn't sure if her heart was brave enough for that. The 2 days of Jasper's absence stretched before Harper like an eternity. The hotel, which had become a sanctuary, now felt vast and achingly empty. The silence he had once shared with her now seemed to mock her, amplifying her own solitude. She tried to work, to fulfill his request to keep the music room alive, but her fingers on the Steinway's keys felt clumsy, the melodies hollow. The piano missed him too. It was as if he were the conductor of their quiet symphony, and without him, the orchestra was lost. She wandered the grounds restlessly, tracing the paths they had walked together. Every corner held a memory. The garden, where they had first seen each other, the cliffside overlook where he had asked her to dinner, the beach where he had almost kissed her. She saw these places now, not as parts of a luxury hotel, but as sacred sites in the geography of her own heart. She had come here to be alone, but she had learned a new, more profound kind of loneliness in his absence. On the second day, a large, flat package was delivered to her room. There was no note, but she knew instantly it was from him. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a framed piece of original sheet music, the paper yellowed with age, the notes written in a beautiful, fading calligraphy. At the bottom, a title was inscribed in elegant script, Serenade for a Star. It was an obscure piece from the late 19th century, a forgotten composer's tribute to a love that seemed as distant and as beautiful as a celestial body. Tears pricked her eyes. It was the most romantic, most thoughtful gift she had ever received. He had not sent flowers or jewels. He had sent her a song. He had sent her a piece of their shared language, a message that transcended the thousands of miles between them. It was his way of telling her that he was thinking of her, that he understood her on a level that no one else ever had. The gift was not about its monetary value. It was about its emotional precision. The gesture broke through the dam of her creative block. She took the sheet music to the West Wing, placed it on the piano, and began to play. The melody was exquisite, a piece of music filled with a quiet, reverent longing. As she played, she began to weave her own melody around it, a vocal counterpart that was both a response and a confession. She sang of a woman who had thought herself a fallen star, hiding her faded light, only to find a man who was not blinded by her former glory, but who saw the quiet, steady glow that still remained. She sang for hours, pouring all of her doubt, her hope, and her burgeoning love into the music. She was no longer just singing for herself, or even for him. She was singing for them. She was composing the soundtrack to their story, a story that had moved beyond a simple hotel romance and into something deeper, something real. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was a single trembling bass note in a chord that was dominated by hope. When she finally finished, the last note hanging in the silent room, she knew she had her answer to the question he had posed before he left. She was ready. She was ready to be just Harper, as long as she could be Harper with his Jasper. He returned not with the fanfare of a limousine, but on foot, walking up the cliffside path from the cove as the sun began to set, as if he were a man returning home from a long journey by sea. Harper felt his arrival before she saw him, a subtle shift in the hotel's atmosphere, a current of energy that seemed to flow directly to the West Wing music room, where she sat before the piano. She was playing her new song, the one that had woven his serenade into the fabric of her own story. Her voice was strong and clear, filled with a certainty that had been absent for so long. The door opened silently. He didn't speak, didn't move to interrupt her. He simply leaned against the door frame, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, his tie loosened. He looked tired from his travels, but his eyes, fixed on her, were brighter and more alive than she had ever seen them. He listened, his expression unreadable, but for the profound stillness that fell over him, the look of a man witnessing a miracle he had only dared to dream of. He was not listening to a performance. He was listening to the answer to a question he had been asking his entire life. When the last note faded, the silence that filled the room was not empty. It was charged, humming with all the emotion of the music, with all the longing of their 2 days apart. She turned on the piano bench to face him, her heart in her throat. "Welcome home," she whispered, and the words felt more true, more right, than any lyrics she had ever written. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. He crossed the room in a few long, purposeful strides, pulling her up from the bench and into his arms. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, and she could feel the faint tremor in his body. "I heard you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "From the garden. I heard you, and I knew. I was already home." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "That song," he said, his voice raw with feeling. "It was everything." He didn't need to elaborate. She knew what he meant. It was the story of their beginning, a testament to the quiet, powerful thing that had grown between them in this gilded sanctuary. There were no more questions, no more hesitations. The time for silent observation and tentative gestures was over. What stood between them now was a powerful, undeniable truth. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was not a kiss of discovery or of comfort. It was a kiss of certainty, of claiming. It was the passionate, desperate kiss of a man who had been starved of her presence, who had seen the cold, sterile reality of his world in Zurich and had run back to the vibrant, colorful life he had found only with her. He was no longer just the owner of the hotel. He was her Jasper, and she was his Harper. Later that night, he led her back to his private rooftop terrace. This time, the table was not set for a formal dinner. Instead, there were 2 comfortable armchairs, a soft cashmere throw, and a single bottle of wine. The stars were brilliant in the clear, moonless sky, a silent audience to their new beginning. He poured them both a glass of wine, his movements relaxed, imbued with a quiet, confident intimacy that spoke of permanence, of a future he was no longer just contemplating, but actively building. He sat beside her, their chairs angled so they could face each other, their knees almost touching. Zurich was gray, he said, his gaze distant for a moment as he recalled the trip, the meetings, the numbers, the expectations. It's a world made of glass and steel and ambition. I have lived in that world my entire life, and I never realized how colorless it was until I met you, until I heard your music fill this place. He turned his eyes back to her, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. I don't want to live in that world anymore, Harper, he said, his voice low and steady. I have more money than I could ever spend, more obligations than I care to count, but none of it means anything. You are the only thing that feels real. He leaned forward, his expression earnest, vulnerable. I want a life with you. Not just in this hotel, not just on this cliffside. I want a real life. I want to wake up with you, to hear you compose in the morning, to argue with you about what to have for dinner. I want all the messy, beautiful, ordinary things. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, antique iron key on the table between them. It was ornate and heavy, clearly belonging to a very old lock. It was nothing like the sleek, modern keycards used in the hotel. This isn't a key to a room, he said softly. It's the key to my home. A small stone house, miles from here, up in the hills. It's quiet. It's private. It was my grandmother's. It's the only place on earth where I am not Jasper Scott. It's where I'm just Jasper. He did not push the key toward her. He simply left it on the table, a silent offering. It was not a demand or an ultimatum. It was a choice. It was the key to his truest, most private self, and he was trusting her to decide whether or not she wanted to unlock that door. The weight of that trust, of that ultimate gesture of vulnerability, was more profound than any declaration of love. He was offering her not just a future, but a home. Harper stared at the iron key, its dark, solid form a stark contrast to the ephemeral, dreamlike quality of their time at the hotel. This was the moment where the fantasy collided with reality. A house, a home, a life outside the gilded cage of the Aurelia Grand. Everything she had been running from, commitment, entanglement, the risk of a broken heart, was symbolized by that small piece of metal. Her old fears, the ghosts of her past, whispered in the back of her mind. Could she do this? Could she, a woman who had built a career on the transient stages of the world, truly settle down? Could she trust that this man, with his immense power and the pull of his vast empire, would not eventually tire of a quiet life? The fear was a cold, familiar knot in her stomach. The music industry had taught her that powerful men always had an agenda, that their affection was often just another form of acquisition. She had promised herself she would never be anyone's beautiful possession again. She looked up from the key and met Jasper's gaze. He was watching her, his expression patient, understanding. It was as if he could see the war raging inside her, could hear the echoes of her past doubts. He didn't pressure her. He didn't try to persuade her with pretty words. He simply waited, giving her the space and the respect to face her own demons. It was in his patient silence that she found her answer. Jasper was not like the others. His power was not a weapon he wielded, but a fortress he hid behind. He wasn't trying to acquire her. He was trying to abdicate his own throne to build a new, quieter kingdom with her. He didn't want to own her song. He wanted to be the silence in which she could create it. He wasn't offering her a cage, no matter how beautiful. He was offering her the key to his own. A slow, sure peace settled over her. The fears were just ghosts, powerless in the face of this profound, tangible reality. Trust wasn't a blind leap. It was a conscious choice. It was a choice to believe in the man in front of her, to believe in the truth of what they had built together, and most importantly, to believe that she was strong enough to love and be loved without losing herself. She had come to this hotel a broken artist, and she had become a whole woman. She reached out, her fingers closing around the cool, heavy iron of the key. She lifted her gaze to his, and her voice when she spoke was as clear and as certain as the final note of a perfect song. "I've never been very good at following the rules," she said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "But I think I'm going to love the quiet." The relief that washed over his face was so profound, so utterly unguarded, it stole her breath away. He stood and gently pulled her to her feet, his hands warm and firm on her arms. He didn't lead her toward the stairs that would take them back to the hotel, but toward a dark, unassuming door at the far end of the terrace she had never noticed before. He unlocked it, not with a key card, but with a traditional key, and led her into his private apartment, the true heart of his sanctuary. The space was nothing like the opulent hotel suites. It was warm, personal, and real. Books were stacked on every surface, the furniture was comfortable and worn, and a soft instrumental jazz record was playing quietly on a vintage turntable. This was his soul, laid bare. It was the space of a man who loved history, music, and quiet contemplation, and he had brought her into it. The air was thick with a new kind of intimacy, the final wall between them crumbling to dust. He turned to her, and the flickering candlelight from the terrace cast a soft glow on his face. The reserved billionaire was gone. The quiet host was gone. There was only Jasper, a man looking at the woman he loved with an emotion so raw and powerful it made her tremble. He traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips, his touch as soft as a whisper. "I have wanted you," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur, "since I heard you humming in the storm. I think I have wanted you my entire life, without ever knowing what I was waiting for." Every word was a vow, a confession that stripped away his last defenses. He was giving her all the pieces of himself, the power, the loneliness, the hope, the desire. She rose on her toes and met his lips, her answer a silent, complete surrender to the love she had been so afraid to feel. The kiss was a slow, deep exploration, a promise of everything to come. It was a seal on the unspoken contract their souls had made. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her from the living area into the quiet darkness of his bedroom. The only light was the pale silver of the starlight filtering through the large windows that overlooked the sea. He laid her gently on the bed, the linens cool and soft against her skin. Every movement was deliberate, reverent, and filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. In the moon-drenched silence, he undressed her slowly, his gaze an act of worship, his touch setting every nerve in her body on fire. This was not about passion or lust. It was about a profound, sacred act of knowing and being known. It was the ultimate expression of trust, the final, beautiful breaking of every rule she had ever set for herself. As he came to lie beside her, gathering her into the warmth and strength of his body, she looked up at him, at the man who had seen her, heard her, and loved her back to life. She was home. The next morning, Harper woke to the sound of a piano. It was a simple, beautiful melody, one she had never heard before, drifting in from the main room. She slipped out of bed, pulling on one of Jasper's soft white shirts that smelled faintly of him, and followed the music. She found him at a small, upright piano in the corner of his living room, his back to her, his fingers moving over the keys with a familiar, gentle grace. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating his form in a golden haze. He wasn't playing a grand classical piece. He was playing a simple, heartfelt tune, a song that sounded like a sunrise, like a quiet, happy morning after a long, dark night. He must have sensed her presence, because he finished the phrase and then turned, a soft, contented smile on his face. "I was just composing," he said, his voice warm in the morning light. "It's called Harper's Key." She walked to him, leaning against the piano, her heart so full she felt it might burst. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers on the keys. She looked around the room, at the stacks of books, at the view of the endless sea, at this man who had unlocked a part of her soul she thought had been lost forever. She remembered the woman who had checked into this hotel, a ghost of herself, armed with rules and shielded by fear. She barely recognized her. She had come here seeking a sanctuary from the world, and instead, she had found her world in one man. She had checked into a luxury hotel to escape, to be invisible, to protect her broken heart. But the mysterious billionaire guest hadn't just broken all her rules. He had taught her that the best songs aren't written behind walls, but in the vulnerable, terrifying, beautiful space where one heart dares to open for another. He had not been a storm to weather, but a harbor she had been searching for all along. He stood up, pulling her into a gentle embrace, and together they looked out the window at the morning light dancing on the water. This was not an ending. It was not a grand finale. It was a quiet, unassuming beginning, the first note in a long and beautiful composition that they would write together. A life filled with music, with silence, and with a love that felt as real and as enduring as the sea itself. She had found her voice. She had found her home. And she had found the one man who understood that both were the very same thing. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. What kind of life do you imagine Jasper and Harper will build together in their quiet stone house?